I don't know what made me realize how many of you watching this right now are being stalked, and you don't even know it yet. Maybe it's because I've spent months collecting these stories for Verified Fears, hearing from real people who thought they were safe, who thought they were careful, who thought they were just living normal lives, until they discovered someone had been watching their every move for weeks, months, or even years. Everyone else around them was going about their daily routines, grabbing coffee, walking to their cars, checking their mail. But there was always someone in the shadows, someone taking notes, someone learning their patterns, someone planning their next move. These aren't fictional horror stories designed to give you a quick scare and let you sleep peacefully tonight. These are 11 real accounts from real people whose lives were turned upside down when they realized that the person sitting 3 tables away at their favorite restaurant wasn't there by coincidence, that the same car they'd been seeing in their neighborhood for weeks wasn't just passing through, and that the feeling of being watched wasn't just paranoia. It was a warning their subconscious was desperately trying to send them. If you think you're safe because you're careful about locking your doors, because you don't share your location on social media, or because you live in a good neighborhood, these stories will shatter that illusion and show you just how easily someone can slip into your life without you ever knowing they were there. But here's what I need you to do right now. If you've ever had that gut feeling that someone was watching you, if you've ever noticed the same person in different places where they shouldn't be, or if you've ever felt like your normal routine was being observed by someone you couldn't quite identify, I need you to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the knowledge you're about to gain from these 11 stories might just save your life, or the life of someone you love. I don't know what made me notice him the first time. I guess what caught my attention was how still he stood on that fire escape across from my apartment building. Everyone else in the neighborhood was rushing to work, walking their dogs, or heading to the subway. But not him. He was just there, perfectly motionless, looking directly at my 3rd-floor window at 7:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October. I was a 24-year-old graphic designer living alone in Brooklyn, and my morning routine was pretty predictable. Coffee first, then I'd sit by my bedroom window with my laptop, checking emails and scrolling through design inspiration while the sunlight streamed in. The apartment was small, but that corner spot by the window was my favorite place to start the day. I knew every building, every fire escape, every rooftop in my view, so yeah, maybe that's why he stood out so much. The second day, he was there again. Same time, same position, same unnaturally still posture. I told myself he must have been a maintenance worker, or maybe someone who lived in that building taking a smoke break, but something felt wrong. The way he was positioned, the way he seemed to be looking directly into my window, it made my skin crawl. I closed my laptop and moved to the kitchen, telling myself I was being paranoid. By the 3rd day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I set my alarm 15 minutes earlier and positioned myself where I could see the fire escape without being visible from outside. At exactly 7:15 a.m. he appeared. Not walking up the stairs, not coming from inside the building. He just materialized on that platform like he'd been waiting somewhere out of sight. He wore the same dark jacket, same baseball cap pulled low, and he stood in the exact same spot, facing my window. I watched him for 25 minutes until I had to leave for work, and he never moved. Not once. The 4th day, I decided to test something. Instead of sitting by my window, I went straight to the kitchen and watched from there. He showed up at 7:15 as usual, but after about 10 minutes of staring at my empty bedroom window, he shifted. He moved to a different part of the fire escape, one that gave him a clear view into my kitchen. My blood went cold. He wasn't just randomly standing there. He was actively looking for me. I started documenting everything. Photos from my phone, notes about what he wore, how long he stayed, any changes in his behavior. The pattern was consistent. 7:15 a.m. arrival, position to watch whichever room I was in, departure around 8:30 a.m. when I left for work. But then things started changing. He began showing up earlier, staying later. Some mornings I'd catch glimpses of him at 6:45, and twice I saw him still there when I returned from lunch breaks. The breaking point came on a Friday morning when I decided to confront the situation head-on. I grabbed my camera with the zoom lens and positioned myself to get a clear shot of his face. The moment I raised the camera, he moved. Not just shifted position. He ducked behind the fire escape railing and disappeared completely. He'd been watching me so intently that he noticed the exact moment I tried to photograph him. That's when I realized this wasn't casual observation. This was calculated, experienced stalking. I called the police that afternoon, but the response was frustrating. They took my report, looked at my photos of an empty fire escape, and basically told me to call back if he actually did something threatening. Standing on a fire escape isn't illegal, the officer explained, even if he's looking at your building. They suggested I install curtains and avoid predictable routines, which felt like being told the stalking was somehow my fault for being visible in my own home. But I wasn't going to just hide and hope he'd go away. I bought blackout curtains for my bedroom and started varying my morning routine. But I also set up a hidden camera pointed at that fire escape. For 3 days, I captured nothing. I started to think maybe he'd moved on. Maybe the police visit to the building had scared him off. Then I reviewed the footage from a night I'd worked late and came home around 11 p.m. He was there, in the darkness, barely visible, but definitely there. The timestamp showed he'd been on that fire escape from 10:30 p.m. until 12:45 a.m., just watching my apartment. But the most disturbing part was what happened at 11:17 p.m., exactly when I'd walked into my bedroom and turned on the lights. The moment my silhouette appeared in the window, even with the new curtains, he moved closer to the railing and stayed in that position till I turned the lights off and went to bed. I took the footage to the police, and this time they took it more seriously. They identified the building and spoke to the landlord, but discovered something that made my situation even more terrifying. That fire escape wasn't connected to any apartment. It was an old emergency exit that had been sealed off years ago, meaning he was climbing up from the alley specifically to reach that vantage point. This wasn't convenient stalking. He was putting in serious effort to watch me. The detective assigned to my case, Detective Martinez, explained that this level of dedication usually meant the stalking would escalate. "He's invested too much time and energy to just stop," she told me. "We need to be proactive." They increased patrols in my area and gave me a direct number to call. But they also recommended I consider relocating temporarily. I refused to be driven from my home, but I did take precautions. I installed additional security cameras, changed my routines completely, and started staying at friends' places unpredictably. For 2 weeks, the fire escape remained empty. I began to hope that the police attention had finally scared him away. Then I found the note. It was slipped under my apartment door on a Wednesday morning, written in block letters on plain white paper. "New cameras won't stop me from caring about you. I know you're scared, but you don't need to be. I'm protecting you. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, and the paper had been folded with precise creases. But what terrified me most was the word caring. This wasn't just voyeurism. In his mind, this was a relationship. Detective Martinez had the note processed for fingerprints and handwriting analysis, but she also delivered news that made everything worse. They'd reviewed security footage from my building and discovered he'd been inside multiple times. The timestamps showed him entering through a basement door that was supposed to be locked, always during hours when most residents were at work. He'd been in my building, walking the halls, possibly even trying door handles. That night, I stayed at my sister's apartment, but I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like a figure watching from outside. The violation wasn't just about privacy anymore. It was about the complete destruction of any sense of safety. He'd turned my home, my neighborhood, my daily routine into a hunting ground where I was always the prey. The resolution came 3 weeks later, but not in the way I'd hoped. Detective Martinez called to tell me they'd arrested someone, but not my stalker. They'd caught a different man breaking into apartments in my building, and during his interrogation, he mentioned seeing some guy who was always hanging around the fire escapes, taking pictures. The stalker had been photographing not just me, but the entire building, possibly casing other apartments or documenting other potential victims. They never caught him. Despite the photos, the video footage, the note, and multiple witness accounts, he simply vanished. Detective Martinez theorized that the arrest of the burglar had spooked him, made him realize the police were actively investigating the building. But she also warned me that stalkers like this rarely just stop. They usually move on to new targets or wait for the attention to die down before resuming. It's been 8 months now, but I still check that fire escape every morning. I still vary my routines, still jump when I hear unexpected sounds, still feel like I'm being watched even when I know I'm alone. I moved to a different apartment, one with no fire escapes and a clear view in all directions. But that feeling of being observed never completely goes away. That kind of fear doesn't just disappear when the immediate threat is gone. It rewires how you see the world, how you move through spaces, how you trust your own sense of safety. The scariest part wasn't the stalking itself, but realizing how easily someone can slip into your life, learn your patterns, and make you a prisoner in your own routine without you even knowing they're there, until it's almost too late. Let's move to our second story. I don't know what made me notice the same silver Honda Civic in my office parking lot every single day for 3 weeks straight. I guess what caught my attention was how it was always there when I arrived at 8:30 a.m. and still there when I left at 6 p.m. But I never saw anyone getting in or out of it. Everyone else in the lot had predictable patterns: arrive, park, walk to the building, reverse the process at the end of the day. But this car just existed in space, like it had been abandoned. Except it was always spotlessly clean and parked in different spots. I was a 28-year-old marketing coordinator working at a mid-sized tech company in Austin, and my parking routine was as boring as it gets. I had a designated spot in the covered garage, level 2, section B. The company had about 200 employees, so the garage was always busy during normal hours. But I'd started staying late to work on a major campaign launch. That's when I began noticing things that didn't make sense during regular business hours. The second week of staying late, I started paying attention to which cars remained after 7 p.m. Most of the garage emptied out by 6:30, leaving maybe 15 vehicles belonging to the cleaning crew, security, and a few other late workers like myself. But that silver Civic was always there, and it wasn't in any of the designated employee spots. It moved around, sometimes on level 1 near the entrance, sometimes on level 3 in the visitors section, but always positioned where it had a clear view of the walkway I used to get to my car. I told myself it must belong to someone who worked different shifts, maybe building maintenance, or someone from the 24-hour security team. But something felt wrong about how it was positioned. The parking spots it chose weren't random. They were strategic. Each location gave a perfect sight line to my route from the elevator to my car. And I started noticing that no matter which level I parked on when I switched spots to test my theory, the Civic would appear on that same level within a day or two. The third week, I decided to document everything. I started taking photos of the car, noting the license plate, recording the times and locations where I spotted it. The pattern was undeniable. The car followed my parking patterns with a delay of 24 to 48 hours, like someone was learning my habits and adjusting accordingly. But the most disturbing discovery came when I started leaving work at different times to see if the pattern held. On Tuesday, I left at 4 p.m. instead of my usual 6 p.m. The Civic wasn't there when I walked to my car, but as I was pulling out of my spot, I saw it entering the garage. On Wednesday, I stayed until 8 p.m., and when I finally headed to the parking garage, the Civic was there, engine running, positioned where the driver could watch both the elevator and the stairwell exits. The moment I appeared, the engine turned off. Someone had been waiting for me. Thursday morning, I arrived at my usual 8:30 a.m. and decided to take a different route to the office, using the stairwell instead of the elevator and entering through a side door I'd never used before. From the stairwell window, I had a perfect view of the parking garage, and what I saw made my hands shake. A man was sitting in the silver Civic, and he was holding what looked like a camera with a long lens pointed directly at my usual walking path, when I didn't appear at my normal time and my normal route. He got out of the car and walked to the elevator area, looking around like he was searching for something, or someone. I called building security immediately, but by the time they reached the garage, the car was gone. The security guard, Marcus, took my report seriously, though. He'd been working there for 6 years and knew every employee's vehicle. That Honda's not registered with any of our tenants, he told me, and if someone's been watching you specifically, we need to involve the police. The police response was more thorough than I'd expected. Detective Chen reviewed the building security footage and discovered something that made my stalking situation much more serious than I'd realized. The Civic had been appearing in our parking garage for almost 2 months, not 3 weeks. I'd only noticed it recently because the driver had gotten bolder, parking closer to my usual spots and staying longer. In the earlier footage, he'd been much more careful, parking on the street outside the building and only entering the garage briefly. But the most chilling discovery came when Detective Chen showed me footage from the camera that monitored the garage entrance. The timestamps revealed that my stalker had been tracking my schedule with incredible precision. On days when I worked late, he'd arrive around 5 p.m. and wait. On days when I left early, he'd show up just before my departure time. He wasn't just randomly hoping to see me. He knew my schedule better than I did. This level of surveillance suggests he's been watching you from multiple locations, Detective Chen explained. The parking garage is just where you noticed him. He's probably been tracking your movements between home and work, maybe even during lunch breaks and weekend errands. The thought that my entire routine had been under observation for months made me feel physically sick. They ran the license plate and discovered the car was registered to a name I didn't recognize. David Kellerman, 34 years old, no criminal record, employed as a freelance photographer. The address led to an apartment complex about 15 minutes from my office. When police visited his apartment for a welfare check, they found it empty, but not abandoned. His neighbors said he'd been gone for about a week, leaving suddenly without notice. The investigation took a disturbing turn when Detective Chen received a call from the apartment complex manager. David Kellerman had been asking detailed questions about the building's security, specifically about which units had views of the parking area and whether there were any female tenants who lived alone. The manager had found it odd, but not threatening enough to report. Now it seemed like he'd been planning something much more serious than parking lot surveillance. They issued a BOLO alert for David Kellerman and his vehicle, and my company increased security measures, including escort services for employees working late. But the waiting was torture. Every silver car I saw made my heart race. Every unexpected sound in the parking garage made me freeze. I started parking in different locations around the city and taking ride shares to work. But the fear followed me everywhere. The resolution came 3 weeks later when police arrested David Kellerman outside a different office building across town. He'd moved on to stalking another woman. But this time someone had noticed his behavior early and called police immediately. When they searched his car, they found a detailed notebook with information about multiple women, including pages and pages about my daily routine, my car, my work schedule, and even notes about my clothing choices and which coffee shop I visited on Friday mornings. Detective Chen showed me some of the entries during the trial preparation. The level of detail was horrifying. Target 1, that was me, always uses north stairwell when running late, wears blue jacket on Mondays, stays late on Tuesdays and Thursdays, parks in same section but different spots, learning to be cautious. He'd been studying me like a research project, documenting my habits and behaviors with scientific precision. But the most disturbing entry was dated just 2 days before his arrest at the other location. Target 1 has become too difficult to observe safely. Police involvement likely. Moving to Target 3. Less security awareness, more predictable patterns. I wasn't just a victim. I was a practice run for someone he considered an easier target. David Kellerman pled guilty to multiple stalking charges and received 2 years in prison, plus 5 years probation, with a restraining order. Detective Chen told me I was lucky. Many stalkers escalate to more serious crimes. But the increased security attention had apparently convinced him to move on rather than risk getting caught. It's been a year and 4 months since his arrest, but I still can't park in the same spot twice. I still check my rearview mirror obsessively, still feel my heart rate spike when I see silver sedans, still take different routes to and from work every single day. I've moved to a new apartment with underground parking and changed jobs to a company with better security. But that feeling of being watched, of being studied and cataloged like a specimen, never completely fades. The scariest part wasn't that someone was following me. It was discovering that I'd been living under surveillance for months without knowing it. That my entire routine had been mapped and analyzed by someone who saw me not as a person, but as a target to be studied, understood, and eventually approached when he felt confident enough in his knowledge of my patterns. Let's move to our third story. I don't know what made me notice that the same guy was always using the equipment right next to mine at the gym, no matter what time I showed up or which machine I chose. I guess what caught my attention was how he never seemed to actually work out. He'd just sit there, adjusting weights, checking his phone, and glancing over at me every few seconds. Everyone else at Fit Zone was focused on their routines, sweating through sets or chatting with friends. But not him. He was performing some kind of elaborate theater where exercise was just the backdrop for something much more sinister. I was a 26-year-old nurse working rotating shifts at the local hospital, and the gym was my sanctuary. After 12-hour shifts dealing with trauma and chaos, those 90 minutes on the elliptical or with the free weights were the only time my mind could truly quiet down. I'd been a member at FitZone for 3 years, knew the regulars, the peak hours, the equipment quirks. So when someone new started appearing in my peripheral vision every single workout, it definitely stood out. The second week, I started testing whether it was just coincidence. I normally worked out around 6 a.m. before my day shifts, but I switched to 10 p.m. after my evening shifts. He was there. I tried Saturday mornings instead of weekdays. He was there. I even showed up at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, a time I'd never been to the gym before, and within 20 minutes of starting my workout, he appeared and set up on the treadmill directly behind my rowing machine. I told myself he must have a similar schedule flexibility. Maybe he was unemployed or worked from home. But the positioning was what made my skin crawl. It wasn't random equipment selection. He was always choosing machines that gave him a direct view of whatever I was doing. When I used the elliptical facing the mirrors, he'd be on the bike behind me, where he could watch my reflection. When I moved to the weights section, he'd suddenly need to use the bench press that faced the squat rack I was using. The third week, I decided to document the pattern. I started noting which machines he used, how long he stayed, and what he actually did during his workouts. The results were disturbing. He rarely completed full sets, never broke a sweat, and spent more time adjusting his position to maintain visual contact with me than actually exercising. On Tuesday, I watched him use the leg press machine for 45 minutes without adding any weight to the bar. He was just going through the motions while keeping his eyes on me. But the breaking point came when I tried to lose him by using the women's only section of the gym. FitZone had a small area with cardio equipment and free weights that was supposed to be a safe space for female members. I thought I'd finally found a way to work out without being watched. I was wrong. Through the glass partition, I could see him pacing around the main gym floor, trying to find angles where he could still observe me. When that didn't work, he positioned himself at the water fountain directly outside the women's section and just stood there, pretending to drink water for 20 minutes while staring through the glass. That's when I realized this wasn't casual gym creeping. This was calculated stalking. I approached the front desk and spoke to Maya, the evening manager I'd gotten to know over the years. She took my concerns seriously and pulled up the guy's membership information. His name was Trevor Walsh. He'd joined the gym 6 weeks ago, and according to the check-in logs, his gym visits perfectly aligned with mine. Not similar schedules, identical schedules. He was somehow tracking when I was there and timing his arrivals accordingly. Maya reviewed the security footage with me, and what we discovered made the situation much more serious than either of us had anticipated. Trevor wasn't just following my workout schedule, he was following me to the gym. The parking lot cameras showed him sitting in his car in the parking lot, waiting for me to arrive, then following me inside after a few minutes. On days when I didn't show up, the footage showed him waiting in the parking lot for over an hour before leaving. "This is stalking," Maya said flatly. "We need to ban him from the premises and call the police." But when she tried to contact Trevor using the information from his membership application, they discovered he'd provided a fake phone number and an address that didn't exist. The credit card he'd used to pay for his membership was valid, but it was registered to a different name entirely. The police took the report seriously, especially when Detective Rodriguez reviewed the security footage and saw the parking lot surveillance behavior. "He's not just watching you at the gym," she explained. "He's tracking your movements to and from the gym, which means he probably knows where you live and work. This level of surveillance typically escalates to more serious crimes." They ran the license plate from the parking lot footage and discovered the car was registered to Trevor Walsh at a legitimate address across town. When they visited his apartment for a welfare check, his roommate answered the door and provided information that made my blood run cold. Trevor had been asking detailed questions about my schedule, specifically about when I worked different shifts at the hospital. He'd somehow figured out where I worked and had been trying to map my entire routine, not just my gym visits. But the most disturbing discovery came when Detective Rodriguez showed me photos from Trevor's apartment. His roommate had given consent for a search, and they'd found a wall covered with printed screenshots from the gym's social media pages. Photos from member events, group fitness classes, and promotional materials. Every single photo that included me had been circled with red marker, and he'd written detailed notes about my clothing, my workout partners, and even my facial expressions. The investigation revealed that Trevor had been using the gym's social media presence to gather information about members' schedules. Fit Zone regularly posted about group classes, member achievements, and special events, often including photos and tagging participants. He'd been cross-referencing these posts with the gym's class schedules to predict when specific members would be there. I wasn't his only target. He'd been tracking at least 4 other women using the same method. They arrested Trevor Walsh at his apartment 3 days later, but not before he'd escalated his behavior in a way that still gives me nightmares. The night before his arrest, he'd followed me home from the gym. I didn't notice because I was exhausted after a double shift. But my neighbor's security camera caught him sitting in his car outside my apartment building for over 2 hours, just watching my windows. Detective Rodriguez said he was probably planning to approach me outside the gym environment, where there would be fewer witnesses and security cameras. Trevor pled guilty to stalking charges for multiple victims and received 18 months in prison, plus 3 years probation with restraining orders. The gym implemented new security measures, including better verification of membership information and increased monitoring of their social media posts to prevent future stalkers from using their online presence as a hunting ground. It's been 10 months since Trevor's arrest, but I still can't work out without constantly checking over my shoulder. I switched to a different gym across town, one with more rigorous membership verification and better security protocols. But that feeling of being watched never completely goes away. I vary my workout times randomly now, never post about fitness activities on social media, and always check the parking lot before entering or leaving the gym. The scariest part wasn't that someone was watching me work out. It was realizing that he'd turned my safe space, the one place where I went to clear my mind and take care of my physical health, into a hunting ground where I was always the prey. He'd weaponized the gym's community atmosphere and social media presence to stalk multiple women simultaneously, turning what should have been a supportive fitness environment into a surveillance operation that made us all feel unsafe in our own bodies. Let's move to our 4th story. The Ring doorbell was supposed to make me feel safer, not reveal that someone had been visiting my front door every single night for 3 months without me knowing. When I installed it in February after a string of break-ins in my neighborhood, I thought I'd finally have peace of mind about home security. Instead, I discovered that my quiet suburban street had been hiding a secret that would completely destroy my sense of safety and privacy. I was a 31-year-old freelance web developer working from my home office in a small town outside Portland. My house was a modest 2-bedroom cottage on a dead-end street with only 6 other homes. the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors and nothing exciting ever happened. I'd lived there for 4 years without incident. So when I started getting motion alerts from my new doorbell camera at random times, I assumed it was just cats or delivery drivers. The first week, I ignored most of the notifications. The Ring app was constantly pinging me about movement, squirrels, mail carriers, neighbors walking their dogs. But when I finally sat down to review a week's worth of footage to adjust the sensitivity settings, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Every single night between 2:30 and 3 a.m., there was a motion alert. Not random times, not different nights. Every night, same time window, for 7 consecutive days. The footage from those late-night alerts showed a figure approaching my front door in the darkness. The night vision made it difficult to see details, but it was clearly a person, not an animal. They would walk up my driveway, stand directly in front of my door for several minutes, then disappear back into the darkness. The timestamp showed these visits had been happening since the day after I installed the camera, which meant they'd probably been happening long before I had any way to detect them. I started checking the footage obsessively, going back through weeks of recordings. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. Every single night, someone was visiting my front door while I slept. Sometimes they stayed for 2 minutes, sometimes for 10, but they always came. On nights when I stayed up late working, they would wait longer before approaching, like they were making sure I was asleep before making their move. The most disturbing discovery came when I reviewed the footage from a night when I'd been out of town visiting my sister. The visitors still came, but this time they tried the door handle. Multiple times. They also walked around to the side of the house where my bedroom window was located, spending almost 15 minutes in that area before returning to the front door and leaving. They weren't just watching. They were testing my security and learning the layout of my property. I called the police immediately, but Detective Williams's response was frustrating. Technically, they're not breaking any laws by standing on your porch, she explained. Unless they're trying to break in or leaving threatening materials, it's difficult to prosecute. She took copies of the footage and promised to increase patrols in my area, but warned me that without being able to identify the person, there wasn't much they could do proactively. But I wasn't going to just wait for the situation to escalate. I installed additional cameras around my property, one covering the side yard, one monitoring the back door, and one focused on the street to capture anyone approaching my house. The results were even more terrifying than I'd anticipated. My nightly visitor wasn't just coming to my front door. They were conducting a full perimeter check of my entire property. The new footage revealed a methodical surveillance routine that had probably been going on for months before I installed the first camera. They would park on the street about 3 houses down, walk through my neighbors' yards to avoid the streetlights, approach my house from the side, check all my windows and doors, spend time at my front door, then circle back to their car using the same hidden route. The entire process took about 20 minutes. And they did it with the confidence of someone who had performed this routine hundreds of times. Detective Williams reviewed the new footage and immediately escalated my case. "This isn't random prowling," she told me. "This is targeted surveillance with clear intent to eventually enter your home. We need to treat this as a serious threat." They set up undercover surveillance of my street and installed additional motion sensors around my property that would alert police directly. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night when my visitor's routine was interrupted by an unexpected police patrol. The officer wasn't part of the undercover operation. He was just doing a routine neighborhood check. But his presence caused my stalker to panic. Instead of following his usual careful route back to his car, he ran directly down the street, and the patrol officer saw him. The chase was brief, and they arrested him 2 blocks from my house. His name was Marcus Chen, a 38-year-old unemployed construction worker who lived about 15 minutes away. When they searched his car, they found detailed notes about my daily routine, including what time I typically went to bed, when I left for grocery shopping, and even notes about which lights I left on when I was home versus when I was away. He'd been studying my habits for months, preparing for something much more serious than nightly visits. But the most chilling discovery came when they searched his apartment. Marcus had been stalking multiple women in the area using the same method: nightly surveillance to learn their routines, then escalating to attempted break-ins when he felt confident about their schedules. I was actually his 4th target. The other 3 women had experienced break-ins that police had initially attributed to random burglaries. But Marcus's notes revealed they were carefully planned invasions based on months of surveillance. Detective Williams showed me some of his notes during the trial preparation. The level of detail was horrifying. Target 4, that was me, works from home, rarely has visitors, bedroom light off by 11 p.m. most nights, leaves for groceries Tuesday afternoons. Front door lock is standard deadbolt, side window has loose screen. He'd been planning to break in during one of my grocery trips, but the doorbell camera had disrupted his timeline. Marcus pled guilty to multiple counts of stalking, attempted burglary, and trespassing. He received 4 years in prison and was required to pay restitution for the security systems all his victims had installed. Detective Williams told me that without the doorbell camera footage, he probably would have successfully broken into my home within a few weeks of his arrest. It's been 7 months since Marcus was sentenced, but I still check my camera footage every morning and every night. I've installed a comprehensive security system with motion sensors, window alarms, and direct police monitoring. But that feeling of being watched and studied never completely goes away. I can't sleep without checking every lock twice, and I still get anxiety attacks when I see motion alerts on my phone, even though I know he's in prison. The scariest part wasn't that someone was visiting my property every night. It was discovering that my entire routine had been under surveillance for months, that someone had been learning my habits and vulnerabilities with the patience and precision of a predator preparing to strike. The doorbell camera that was supposed to make me feel safer had actually revealed just how unsafe I'd been all along, living under nightly surveillance without any idea that my privacy and security had been completely compromised. Let's move to our 5th story. What started as innocent Instagram likes and comments quickly escalated into a digital investigation that revealed someone had been piecing together my entire life from fragments of information I'd shared online over the past 2 years. When I finally realized the scope of what was happening, I discovered that my social media presence had been turned into a roadmap for someone who knew more about my daily routine, my relationships, and my personal history than some of my closest friends. I was a 29-year-old marketing manager living in Denver, and like most people my age, I had a pretty active social media presence. Instagram stories about my morning coffee, Facebook check-ins at restaurants, LinkedIn updates about work projects. Nothing that seemed particularly revealing or dangerous. I'd always been careful about privacy settings and never posted my exact location in real time. So I thought I was being responsible about online safety. The first sign something was wrong came through a seemingly innocent direct message on Instagram from someone named Jake Morrison. He'd commented on a few of my photos over the past month. Nothing creepy, just normal responses like, "Great shot," or "Love this place." So when he messaged me asking about the hiking trail in one of my weekend photos, it seemed like a genuine question from a fellow outdoor enthusiast. But his follow-up messages revealed knowledge that made me uncomfortable. He knew I hiked most Saturday mornings, that I usually went alone, and that I preferred trails in the Boulder area. When I asked how he knew so much about my hiking habits, he said he'd noticed patterns in my posts. That phrase, "notice patterns," made my skin crawl. But I tried to convince myself he was just being observant about publicly available information. The situation escalated when Jake started referencing details from my life that I'd never posted directly. He mentioned my job at a specific marketing firm, knew I had a younger sister who lived in California, and even referenced a minor car accident I'd been in 3 months earlier. When I confronted him about how he knew these things, he claimed he was good at connecting dots and had pieced together information from various posts and comments. I started reviewing my social media history with a critical eye, trying to figure out what information I'd inadvertently shared. What I discovered was terrifying. Over 2 years of posts, stories, comments, and tagged photos had created a detailed portrait of my life that was far more revealing than I'd ever intended. A check-in at my gym combined with workout selfies revealed my exercise schedule. Photos with co-workers at company events showed where I worked. Comments on my sister's posts revealed family relationships and travel plans. But Jake had gone beyond just analyzing my posts. He'd been systematically researching everyone in my social network. He'd looked up my friends, my co-workers, my family members, and had been gathering information about me from their social media accounts as well. A comment my co-worker made about Sarah always staying late on Thursdays, combined with my own posts about work stress, had given him insights into my schedule that I'd never directly shared. The breaking point came when Jake sent me a message that included details about my apartment building and my car. He knew I drove a blue Honda Civic, that I lived in a building with a red brick facade, and that I usually parked on the street rather than in the building's garage. None of this information had come from my social media directly, but he'd apparently been using the background details in my photos to identify my location, and had possibly been conducting physical surveillance to fill in the gaps. I immediately blocked Jake on all platforms and reported his accounts, but the damage was already done. He'd created a comprehensive profile of my life using information that I'd shared voluntarily, and there was no way to take it back. I contacted the police, but Detective Santos explained that using publicly available social media information wasn't technically illegal, even when it was used for stalking purposes. However, Detective Santos took my case seriously when I showed her the progression of Jake's messages and the level of detail he'd gathered. This type of digital stalking often escalates to physical stalking, she warned me. He's already demonstrated that he's willing to invest significant time and effort into learning about your life. We need to assume he might try to make contact in person. They traced Jake Morrison's social media accounts and discovered they were fake profiles created specifically for stalking purposes. The photos he used were stolen from other people's accounts, and the personal information in his profiles was completely fabricated. But the IP address tracking revealed he was located in the Denver area, which meant he had local access to verify information he'd gathered online through physical surveillance. The investigation took a disturbing turn when police discovered Jake had been using the same method to stalk at least 6 other women in the Denver area. He would spend months building fake social media profiles, gradually engaging with his targets through likes and comments to establish familiarity, then escalate to direct messages where he would reveal increasingly detailed knowledge about their lives to demonstrate his interest and compatibility. Detective Santos showed me examples of his interactions with other victims, and the pattern was identical to my experience. He would start with innocent engagement, gradually reveal more detailed knowledge, then begin making suggestions about meeting in person based on shared interests he'd identified through his research. 2 of his previous targets had actually met him in person before realizing something was wrong, and 1 had been followed home after declining his advances. The breakthrough in the case came when Jake made a critical mistake. In trying to impress me with his knowledge, he'd referenced a photo I'd posted from inside a specific coffee shop, mentioning details about the interior that weren't visible in my picture. This meant he'd either been to that location himself or had been watching me there. Detective Santos set up surveillance at the coffee shop, and they caught Jake sitting there with a laptop, scrolling through social media accounts and taking notes. When they arrested Jake Peterson, his real name, they found detailed files on dozens of women, including printed screenshots of social media posts, hand-drawn maps of locations mentioned in posts, and timelines of daily routines he'd constructed from online activity. My file was over 50 pages long and included information dating back 3 years, long before he'd ever interacted with my accounts directly. Jake pled guilty to multiple counts of stalking and harassment and received 2 years in prison plus 5 years probation with restrictions on his internet usage. Detective Santos told me that digital stalking cases like this were becoming increasingly common as people shared more of their lives online without realizing how that information could be weaponized by someone with malicious intent. It's been 14 months since Jake's arrest, but I've completely changed how I interact with social media. I've made all my accounts private, stopped posting location-based content, and regularly audit my friend lists to remove people I don't know personally. I still get anxiety when I receive messages from people I don't recognize, and I'm constantly aware of how much information I'm revealing through seemingly innocent posts. The scariest part wasn't that someone was following me online. It was discovering that years of normal social media activity had created a detailed blueprint of my life that could be used by anyone with enough patience and dedication to piece together the fragments. Jake had turned my digital footprint into a surveillance tool, using my own posts and the posts of people in my network to build a comprehensive profile that gave him insights into my routine, my relationships, and my vulnerabilities that I'd never intended to share with anyone, let alone a stranger with predatory intentions. Let's move to our 6th story. Finding a small black device attached to the underside of my car wasn't something I ever expected to deal with. But when my mechanic called me with concern in his voice during what should have been a routine oil change, I knew my life was about to become much more complicated. What started as a simple maintenance appointment turned into the discovery that someone had been tracking my every movement for months, turning my car into a mobile surveillance device that broadcast my location 24/7. I was a 27-year-old physical therapist working at a rehabilitation center in Phoenix, and my schedule was fairly predictable. Home to work, work to the grocery store, occasional visits to my parents' house across town. Nothing that seemed worth tracking or monitoring. I drove a reliable but unremarkable Toyota Camry that I'd owned for 3 years, and I'd never had any reason to suspect that someone might be interested in my daily movements. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning when I dropped my car off at Martinez Auto Repair for routine maintenance. Tony Martinez had been servicing my car since I bought it. So when he called me 2 hours later, asking if I knew about the device attached to your car, I initially thought he was talking about some kind of factory-installed part I wasn't familiar with. "This isn't from Toyota," Tony explained when I arrived at his shop. He showed me a small black rectangular device about the size of a matchbox. that had been magnetically attached to the metal frame underneath my rear bumper. This is a GPS tracker, and it's been sending your location to someone in real time. The battery level suggests it's been there for months, maybe longer. The device was sophisticated, not some cheap tracking gadget you could buy online, but professional-grade equipment with cellular connectivity and long battery life. Tony had seen similar devices before, usually attached to vehicles by private investigators or law enforcement, but never hidden on a civilian's car without their knowledge. The placement was strategic too, positioned where it wouldn't be visible during casual inspection, but would maintain clear satellite reception. I called the police immediately, and Detective Rodriguez took the situation seriously from the moment she saw the device. This type of equipment is expensive and requires technical knowledge to install and monitor, she explained. Whoever placed this on your car has been tracking your movements with precision that goes far beyond casual stalking. They know everywhere you've been, how long you stayed, and probably have detailed patterns of your daily routine. The investigation revealed that the tracker had been active for at least 4 months, possibly longer. The device stored location data locally and transmitted it to a monitoring service that could be accessed through a smartphone app or website. Detective Rodriguez explained that whoever was tracking me had real-time access to my location and could set up alerts for when I arrived at or left specific locations. But the most disturbing aspect of the discovery was what it implied about my stalker's access to my vehicle. The tracker hadn't been casually stuck to my car. It required crawling underneath the vehicle and finding a secure mounting point. This meant someone had been close enough to my car for long enough to perform this installation without being detected. They'd probably done it while my car was parked at home, at work, or at some other location where I regularly left it unattended. Detective Rodriguez had the device analyzed by the police department's tech unit, and what they discovered made my situation much more serious than a simple tracking case. The device was registered to a monitoring service that required a credit card and personal information to activate. The account had been created using a fake name and address, but the credit card was real and led them to a person who would soon turn my life upside down. The credit card belonged to Ryan Mitchell, a 35-year-old IT specialist who worked for a company that installed security systems for businesses. His technical background explained how he'd known which type of tracker to buy and how to install it without detection. But when police visited his apartment to question him about the device, they discovered evidence that made my stalking case part of a much larger criminal operation. Ryan had been tracking multiple women using the same method, and his apartment contained detailed files on at least 8 different targets. My file included printed maps showing my daily routes, timestamps of my arrivals and departures from various locations, and even notes about which parking spots I typically used at different destinations. He'd been using the GPS data to build comprehensive profiles of his targets' routines and vulnerabilities. The investigation revealed that Ryan had been using his access to security system installations to gather information about potential targets. When his company installed alarm systems or security cameras for female clients, he would note their personal information and sometimes return later to install tracking devices on their vehicles. He'd been operating this scheme for over 2 years, using his professional credentials to gain access to women's homes and personal information. Detective Rodriguez showed me some of the evidence from Ryan's apartment, and the level of surveillance was terrifying. He had detailed schedules for all his targets, including notes about when they were typically home alone, when they traveled, and even information about their family members and romantic relationships. The GPS tracking was just one component of a comprehensive surveillance operation that included social media monitoring and physical observation. But the most chilling discovery came when they analyzed the data from my tracker. Ryan hadn't just been passively monitoring my location. He'd been using the information to conduct physical surveillance. The data showed that on multiple occasions, he'd positioned himself at locations where I was going to be, apparently using the real-time tracking to intercept my movements. He'd been at the grocery store when I was shopping, at the gas station when I was filling up, and had even been in the parking lot at my work on several occasions. The case broke open when police discovered that Ryan had escalated his behavior with one of his other targets. He'd used the GPS tracking data to break into her apartment while she was at work, stealing personal items and installing hidden cameras. When they arrested him at his workplace, he was in the process of planning similar break-ins for his other targets, including me. Ryan Mitchell pled guilty to multiple felony charges, including stalking, burglary, identity theft, and illegal surveillance. He received 6 years in prison and was required to pay restitution for all the security measures his victims had to install. Detective Rodriguez told me that without the mechanic's discovery of the tracker, Ryan probably would have escalated to breaking into my home within weeks of his arrest. It's been 11 months since Ryan was sentenced, but I still have my car checked for tracking devices every time I get it serviced. I've moved to a new apartment with covered parking and installed a comprehensive security system. But that feeling of being constantly monitored never completely goes away. I vary my routes randomly now, park in different locations, and am constantly aware of who might be watching my movements. The scariest part wasn't that someone had been tracking my car. It was discovering that months of my life had been under complete surveillance, that someone had been using professional-grade equipment and technical expertise to monitor my every movement with the intention of eventually using that information to violate my privacy and safety in ways I never could have imagined. The GPS tracker had turned my car into a broadcasting device that eliminated any possibility of privacy or unpredictability in my daily routine. Let's move to our 7th story. Being awake at 3:17 a.m. to witness someone standing in my living room wasn't part of my usual insomnia routine. But when I saw the silhouette of a stranger moving through my apartment while I lay frozen in my bedroom, I realized that months of feeling watched had escalated into the nightmare scenario I'd been unconsciously preparing for. The person who had been studying my life from a distance had finally decided it was time for a face-to-face meeting. I was a 32-year-old graphic designer living alone in a converted loft apartment in Minneapolis, and my sleep schedule had been erratic for months due to work stress and anxiety I couldn't quite explain. I'd been waking up at random hours feeling like something was wrong, checking locks and windows before convincing myself I was being paranoid. That night, my insomnia probably saved my life, because I was awake when my stalker finally made his move. The sound that initially woke me was so subtle I almost dismissed it. A soft scraping noise that could have been the building settling or neighbors moving around upstairs. But something about the rhythm felt wrong, too deliberate and careful to be accidental. I lay in bed listening, trying to identify the source, when I heard the unmistakable sound of my front door closing with the gentle click of someone trying to be silent. My apartment was a studio layout with my bed positioned behind a partial wall that created a separate sleeping area. From my bed, I had a limited view of the main living space, but I could see shadows moving across the wall from the streetlight outside. What I saw made my blood freeze. The shadow of a person moving slowly and deliberately through my apartment, clearly familiar with the layout and trying not to make noise. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering my address and situation to the dispatcher while trying to control my breathing. The intruder was moving methodically through my space, and from the sounds, They were examining my belongings rather than stealing them. I could hear drawers being opened carefully, papers being shuffled, and the soft footsteps of someone who knew exactly where they wanted to go. The most terrifying moment came when the footsteps stopped directly outside my bedroom area. Through the gap at the bottom of the partial wall, I could see feet positioned just inches from where I was hiding. They stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. And I realized they were listening, trying to determine if I was asleep or aware of their presence. The silence was so complete, I was afraid they could hear my heartbeat. Then I heard something that made me understand this wasn't a random break-in. They whispered my name. Not loudly, just a soft, "Sarah," like they were checking if I was awake. The familiarity in their voice, the way they said my name like they knew me personally, made it clear this was someone who had been planning this encounter. They weren't there to steal my belongings. They were there for me. The police arrived within 6 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. I heard my front door open and close again just before the sirens became audible, which meant my intruder had been monitoring police response times and had planned their escape route. When the officers searched my apartment, they found evidence that made my situation much more serious than a simple break-in. Detective Kim showed me what they'd discovered. My personal documents had been carefully examined and photographed. My laptop had been accessed. It was still warm and showed recent activity. Most disturbing, they'd left behind a small digital camera hidden behind a picture frame, positioned to record my bedroom area. This wasn't just an invasion. It was an installation of permanent surveillance equipment. The investigation revealed that my intruder had been inside my apartment before. The lock showed signs of previous manipulation, and they'd clearly spent time learning the layout and identifying the best hiding spots for surveillance equipment. Detective Kim explained that this level of familiarity suggested they'd been conducting reconnaissance visits for weeks or months, probably while I was at work. But the breakthrough came when they analyzed the digital camera. The device had been recording for 3 days before I discovered it, which meant my intruder had been inside my apartment earlier in the week to install it. The footage showed them moving through my space with complete confidence, examining my belongings and even sitting on my couch for extended periods like they owned the place. The camera also captured something that made my blood run cold. They'd been inside my apartment the previous Sunday while I was visiting my parents. The timestamp showed them spending over 2 hours in my space, going through my closet, examining my personal photos, and even lying on my bed. They'd been treating my home like their own private space, coming and going as they pleased while I remained completely unaware. Detective Kim traced the camera's serial number and discovered it had been purchased with a credit card belonging to Marcus Webb, a 29-year-old maintenance worker for my building's management company. His access to master keys explained how he'd been entering my apartment without forced entry, and his work schedule gave him detailed knowledge of when tenants were typically home or away. When they arrested Marcus at his apartment, they found evidence that made my case part of a much larger criminal operation. He'd been using his maintenance access to stalk multiple female tenants in buildings managed by his company. My apartment contained detailed files on at least 12 different women, including floor plans of their apartments, copies of their lease applications, and schedules he'd developed by observing their routines. The most disturbing evidence was a collection of personal items he'd stolen from various apartments during his unauthorized visits. He had jewelry, clothing, photographs, and even prescription medications belonging to his targets. Detective Kim explained that he'd been escalating his behavior over time, starting with simple surveillance and progressing to extended visits and theft of personal items. Marcus had been planning something much more serious for the night I caught him. They found detailed notes about my sleep schedule, my work routine, and even my family's visiting patterns. He'd been preparing for a confrontation, possibly planning to be waiting for me when I came home, or to approach me while I was sleeping. The camera installation had been his way of confirming the best time to make his move. Marcus Webb pled guilty to multiple felony charges, including breaking and entering, stalking, theft, and illegal surveillance. He received 8 years in prison and was banned from working in any capacity that provided access to residential properties. Detective Kim told me that his arrest prevented what could have escalated to much more serious crimes against multiple victims. It's been 13 months since Marcus was sentenced, but I moved out of that apartment immediately and now live in a building with enhanced security and no maintenance staff access to individual units. I still wake up at random hours checking locks and windows, and I have security cameras throughout my new apartment that alert me to any movement. The feeling of safety in my own home never fully returned. The scariest part wasn't that someone broke into my apartment. It was discovering that my home had been violated repeatedly over months, that someone with legitimate access had been treating my private space as their personal playground, while I remained completely unaware that my most intimate moments were being observed, and my personal belongings were being examined by someone who saw me not as a person, but as a target to be studied, monitored, and eventually confronted when they felt ready to escalate their obsession to a face-to-face encounter. Let's move to our 8th story. Opening my mailbox to find my own jewelry inside a padded envelope with no return address was confusing enough. But when I realized the necklace had been missing from my apartment for over 2 months without me noticing, I understood that someone had been inside my home, carefully selecting and borrowing my personal belongings before returning them with disturbing modifications that turned familiar objects into psychological weapons. I was a 30-year-old veterinary technician living in a ground-floor apartment in Sacramento, and I'd always been somewhat disorganized with my personal belongings. Jewelry scattered across my dresser, clothes in the various stages of being put away, books and papers stacked in random piles. My living space was lived in rather than meticulously organized. So when small items occasionally went missing, I usually assumed I'd misplaced them rather than considering more sinister explanations. The first returned item was a silver bracelet I'd inherited from my grandmother. It arrived in my mailbox on a Wednesday afternoon, carefully wrapped in tissue paper inside a small box with no identifying information. I'd been looking for that bracelet for weeks, assuming I'd lost it during a move or left it at a friend's house. Finding it returned anonymously was strange, but I convinced myself someone had found it and was being kind by returning it. But when I examined the bracelet more closely, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. It had been cleaned and polished to a shine it hadn't had in years, and there was a small additional charm attached, a tiny silver heart that definitely hadn't been there before. Someone had not only taken my bracelet, but had modified it, adding their own touch before returning it like some kind of twisted gift. The second returned item arrived a week later, a book of poetry I'd been reading before bed. Again, it came in an unmarked envelope with no return address. But this time, there were clear signs of tampering. Pages had been bookmarked with small pieces of paper, and certain passages about love and devotion had been highlighted in pencil. Someone had been reading my book, studying my reading habits, and marking sections they found significant. I started paying closer attention to my belongings, taking inventory of what was where and noting when things seemed out of place. What I discovered was terrifying. Items were disappearing and reappearing in cycles. A scarf would vanish from my closet, then return 2 weeks later, freshly laundered and folded more neatly than I ever folded anything. A coffee mug would disappear from my kitchen, then show up in my mailbox wrapped in bubble wrap. The pattern became clear when I found a detailed list hidden inside one of the returned books. Written in careful handwriting, it documented every item that had been taken, when it was removed, and when it was returned. The list included items I hadn't even noticed were missing. A hair tie, a pen from my nightstand, a small decorative candle, even a pair of socks from my laundry basket. Someone had been systematically borrowing my belongings for months. But the most disturbing entries on the list were the notes about why each item had been selected. Next to my grandmother's bracelet. Wears this when she's sad. Smells like her perfume. Next to the poetry book, reads before sleep. Pages 47 to 52 are her favorites. Next to a sweater, wore this on our first meeting at the coffee shop. The person taking my belongings had been studying my emotional attachments and personal habits. I called the police immediately, and Detective Martinez took the situation seriously when she saw the list and the returned items. "This is psychological stalking," she explained. "They're not taking your belongings for monetary value. They're taking them to feel closer to you, to have something that's been part of your daily routine. The fact that they're returning them suggests they want you to know what they're doing." The investigation revealed that my stalker had been gaining access to my apartment through a window in my bathroom that didn't lock properly. The window was small and positioned high on the wall, which explained why I'd never considered it a security risk. But someone determined enough could squeeze through, and the bathroom location meant they could enter and exit without being seen from the street. Detective Martinez had the apartment dusted for fingerprints, and they found evidence that confirmed my worst fears. My stalker had been inside my apartment regularly, not just to take and return items, but to spend extended time in my space. They'd found fingerprints on my refrigerator, my computer keyboard, even on my pillow. Someone had been living in my apartment part-time while I was at work. The breakthrough came when they analyzed one of the returned items more carefully. The coffee mug had been returned with a small chip that hadn't been there before, and inside the chip they found DNA evidence. The sample led them to Robert Chen, a 26-year-old delivery driver who had access to my building through his work route. He'd been delivering packages to my building for months and had apparently been studying the residents' schedules. When they arrested Robert at his apartment, they found a shrine dedicated to me and the other women he'd been stalking. My returned belongings were displayed alongside items stolen from at least 4 other women, all arranged like museum exhibits with detailed notes about when and where each item had been acquired. He'd been treating his victims' personal belongings like sacred relics. The most chilling discovery was Robert's journal, which documented his belief that by borrowing and caring for our belongings, he was forming intimate relationships with his targets. He wrote detailed entries about how my bracelet had absorbed my essence, and how sleeping with my pillow had made him feel connected to my dreams. He'd convinced himself that the borrowing and returning was a form of courtship. Robert had been escalating his behavior in ways that made my situation much more dangerous than simple theft. His journal revealed plans to eventually approach me directly, using his knowledge of my belongings and habits to convince me that we had a special connection. He'd been preparing for a confrontation where he would reveal the extent of his surveillance and expect me to be grateful for his care of my possessions. Robert Chen pled guilty to multiple counts of breaking and entering, stalking, and theft. He received 5 years in prison and was required to undergo psychological evaluation and treatment. Detective Martinez told me that his arrest prevented what could have escalated to kidnapping or worse. As his journal indicated, he was planning to take me along with my belongings. It's been 16 months since Robert was sentenced. But I moved to a new apartment immediately and replaced everything he'd touched. I still feel violated when I handle my remaining belongings, wondering what else had been borrowed and returned without my knowledge. The idea that someone had been sleeping in my bed, using my personal items, and treating my private space like their own personal museum never stops being horrifying. The scariest part wasn't that someone was stealing my belongings. It was discovering that my most personal possessions had been turned into tools for psychological manipulation. That someone had been using my own items to build an imaginary relationship with me while violating my privacy and safety in ways that made every object in my home feel contaminated by their obsession and delusion. Let's move to our 9th story. Discovering that someone had created fake social media profiles using my photos and personal information was disturbing enough. But when my own family started receiving friend requests from me, and my coworkers began asking about posts I'd never made, I realized that my identity had been stolen and weaponized to create a parallel version of my life that was being used to manipulate everyone I cared about. I was a 33-year-old high school teacher living in Charlotte, and I'd always been cautious about my online presence. My social media accounts were set to private. I rarely posted personal information, and I was selective about who I accepted as friends or followers. So when my sister called me on a Sunday morning asking why I'd sent her a strange message on Facebook, I initially thought there had been some kind of technical glitch or misunderstanding. "You sent me a message at 2 a.m. asking for money," my sister explained. "You said you were stranded in Atlanta and needed $300 for a bus ticket home. I tried calling you, but it went straight to voicemail, so I figured you'd explain later." The problem was, I'd been asleep in my own bed at 2 a.m., and I hadn't been to Atlanta in over a year. Someone was impersonating me online and targeting my family members. I immediately checked my Facebook account and found nothing unusual. No sent messages, no posts I hadn't made. No sign that my account had been compromised. But when I searched for my name on the platform, I discovered something that made my stomach drop. There was another profile using my name, my photos, and detailed information about my life. But it wasn't my account. Someone had created a duplicate version of me. The fake profile was sophisticated and convincing. It used photos from my real social media accounts, but also included pictures I'd never posted publicly. Photos from my classroom, my apartment, even pictures of me at family gatherings that had been taken from other people's accounts. The biographical information was accurate down to details like my job, my education, and even my pet's name. Someone had done extensive research to create a believable duplicate of my online identity. But the most disturbing aspect was how the fake profile was being used to interact with people from my real life. The impersonator had sent friend requests to my family members, my co-workers, and even my students' parents, using our existing relationships to gain trust and access to their personal information. Many people had accepted the requests, assuming it was just a new account I'd created. I started documenting every interaction the fake profile had made, and the pattern was deeply unsettling. The impersonator wasn't just randomly messaging people, they were using detailed knowledge of my relationships to craft personalized messages that seemed authentic. They knew which family members might be willing to lend money, which co-workers I was closest to, and even which parents from my school were most likely to engage in conversation. The situation escalated when I received a call from my principal asking about inappropriate posts I'd allegedly made about the school. The fake profile had been posting complaints about school policies, criticism of other teachers, and even inappropriate comments about students. These posts were being attributed to me, and my professional reputation was being destroyed by someone pretending to be me online. I contacted Facebook immediately to report the fake account, but their response was frustratingly slow. While I waited for them to investigate, the impersonator continued using my identity to cause damage. They posted controversial political opinions that contradicted my actual beliefs, shared personal information about my family members, and even began flirting with men in my social circle, creating awkward situations and damaging my relationships. The police took my report seriously when Detective Johnson saw the extent of the impersonation. "This isn't just identity theft," she explained. "This is targeted harassment designed to destroy your reputation and relationships." The level of detail suggests someone who knows you personally and has access to information that isn't publicly available. The investigation revealed that my impersonator had been gathering information about me from multiple sources over several months. They'd been monitoring not just my social media accounts, but also the accounts of my friends and family members, collecting photos and personal details to create a comprehensive fake identity. They'd even been using information from my school's website and public records to add authenticity to the fake profile. But the breakthrough came when Detective Johnson analyzed the timing and content of the fake posts. The impersonator had made several references to events and conversations that had happened in my workplace, information that would only be available to someone who worked at my school or had close contact with someone who did. This narrowed the suspect pool significantly. The case broke open when they discovered that my impersonator had been using the fake profile to gather information about other people as well. They'd been befriending my coworkers and family members, not just to damage my reputation, but to collect personal information about them for identity theft and fraud. Several people had shared sensitive information with a fake profile, thinking they were talking to me. Detective Johnson traced the fake accounts to Linda Morrison, a substitute teacher who had worked at my school intermittently over the past year. Linda had been passed over for a full-time position that I'd been offered, and she'd apparently decided to destroy my reputation and relationships as revenge. She'd been using her access to the school environment to gather information about my personal life and professional relationships. When they arrested Linda at her apartment, they found evidence that made my case part of a much larger scheme. She'd been creating fake profiles for multiple teachers and school employees, using their identities to spread rumors, damage reputations, and even commit fraud. My case was just the most elaborate example of a pattern of behavior that had been affecting the entire school district. Linda had been planning to escalate her impersonation in ways that could have destroyed my career permanently. They found drafts of posts she planned to make using my identity, including fake confessions to inappropriate relationships with students and admissions of illegal activities. She'd been building toward accusations that would have resulted in criminal charges and the permanent destruction of my professional life. Linda Morrison pled guilty to multiple counts of identity theft, fraud, and harassment. She received 3 years in prison and was banned from working in educational settings. Detective Johnson told me that her arrest prevented similar attacks on dozens of other victims and stopped a scheme that could have destroyed multiple careers and families. It's been 18 months since Linda was sentenced, but the damage to my reputation and relationships took much longer to repair. I had to have difficult conversations with family members, friends, and co-workers, explaining that the person they'd been interacting with online wasn't actually me. Some relationships never fully recovered from the confusion and mistrust the impersonation had created. The scariest part wasn't that someone had stolen my identity. It was discovering that my entire online presence had been duplicated and weaponized to destroy my relationships and reputation. That someone had used my own photos and personal information to create a version of me that said and did things I would never say or do, turning my identity into a tool for psychological warfare that damaged not just my life, but the lives of everyone who cared about me. Let's move to our 10th story. Testifying in court against someone who had been stalking me for 3.5 years should have been the end of my nightmare. But when the judge sentenced Michael Torres to only 18 months in prison with the possibility of parole in 9 months, I realized that the legal system's idea of justice was very different from a victim's need for safety and closure. What followed was a grueling legal marathon that stretched across multiple states and involved more courtrooms, lawyers, and sleepless nights than I ever imagined possible. I was a 35-year-old real estate agent working in Tucson when Michael first appeared in my life as what seemed like a legitimate client interested in purchasing a home. He'd contacted my office through the standard channels, had pre-approval for a mortgage, and seemed like any other buyer looking for property in the area. It wasn't until months later that I discovered he'd never had any intention of buying a house. He'd simply been using the home buying process as a way to gain access to my personal information and schedule. The stalking began subtly during what I thought were normal client interactions. Michael would request to see properties at specific times, always insisting that I be the agent to show him around. He'd ask detailed questions about my other clients, my work schedule, and my personal life, under the guise of making conversation during property tours. Looking back, I realize he was conducting interviews disguised as small talk, gathering information about my routine and relationships. When Michael's house hunting stretched into its 4th month without any serious offers or narrowing of criteria, I began to suspect something was wrong. He'd seen over 30 properties, but always found reasons to reject them, and his requests were becoming more personal. He wanted to see homes near where I lived, asked about properties where I'd be working alone, and began suggesting that we meet for coffee to discuss his housing needs outside of official showings. The situation escalated when I tried to transfer Michael to another agent in my office. He became agitated and insisted that he'd only work with me, claiming we had developed a special professional relationship that he didn't want to disrupt. When I explained that another agent could better serve his needs, he began showing up at properties where I was conducting showings for other clients, claiming he was just in the neighborhood and wanted to see the house as well. I documented every interaction and reported my concerns to my broker, who agreed that Michael's behavior was inappropriate and potentially dangerous. We decided to terminate our professional relationship and sent him a formal letter explaining that our agency would no longer be able to assist him with his housing search. His response was to escalate his stalking behavior beyond the professional realm into my personal life. Michael began appearing at restaurants where I was having dinner, at the grocery store where I shopped, and even at my gym during my regular workout times. He'd maintain distance and never approach me directly, but his presence was constant and clearly intentional. When I confronted him about following me, he claimed these encounters were coincidental and that he was simply going about his daily routine in the same areas where I happened to be. The first legal intervention came when I obtained a restraining order against Michael after documenting dozens of these coincidental encounters over a 6-week period. The order required him to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, my workplace, and any location where I was present. For 2 weeks, the restraining orders seemed to work. I didn't see Michael anywhere. and I began to hope that the legal consequences had convinced him to move on. But Michael's response to the restraining order was to become more sophisticated in his stalking methods. Instead of following me personally, he began hiring private investigators to monitor my activities and report back to him. I discovered this when one of the investigators contacted me directly, explaining that he'd been hired to conduct surveillance on me, but had become uncomfortable with the assignment when he realized it was being used for stalking purposes. The private investigator, James Rodriguez, provided testimony that became crucial to building a criminal case against Michael. He'd been hired to document my daily routine, photograph my interactions with other people, and even follow me on dates to gather information about my romantic relationships. Michael had been paying for professional-grade surveillance that violated the restraining order while maintaining plausible deniability about his personal involvement. Detective Williams built a comprehensive case against Michael that included evidence of restraining order violations, harassment, and conspiracy to commit stalking through hired surveillance. But when the case went to trial, Michael's defense attorney argued that hiring private investigators wasn't technically illegal, and that Michael himself hadn't violated the restraining order since he'd maintained the required distance. The trial lasted 3 weeks and required me to testify about every aspect of Michael's stalking behavior, from the initial fake client relationship through the escalated surveillance campaign. I had to relive months of fear and anxiety while Michael sat in the courtroom staring at me, taking notes, and occasionally smiling when I described particularly distressing incidents. The legal process felt like a continuation of the stalking itself. Michael was convicted on multiple charges, but the sentence was devastatingly inadequate. 18 months in prison with the possibility of parole in 9 months for 3.5 years of systematic stalking that had destroyed my sense of safety and forced me to change jobs, move apartments, and alter every aspect of my daily routine. The judge explained that since Michael had never physically harmed me or made explicit threats, the sentencing guidelines limited the punishment he could impose. But the legal nightmare was far from over. Michael appealed his conviction, which meant the case remained active, and I had to remain available for additional testimony. During the appeals process, I discovered that Michael had been using his time in prison to research my life further, requesting copies of court documents that contained my personal information and even attempting to contact my family members through other inmates' visitors. The appeals process took 14 months, during which Michael's sentence was reduced to time served, plus probation, due to overcrowding in the prison system. He was released after serving only 7 months of his original 18-month sentence, and the terms of his probation were less restrictive than the original restraining order had been. I was notified of his release through a form letter that arrived 2 days after he'd already been freed. Michael's release triggered a new wave of stalking behavior that was more sophisticated and legally careful than his previous campaign. He moved to a different state, but continued monitoring my social media accounts, sending gifts and letters through intermediaries, and even hiring people to take photographs of me from public spaces where his presence wouldn't violate his probation terms. The interstate nature of Michael's continued stalking created jurisdictional complications that made legal intervention much more difficult. Local police in my area couldn't arrest him for activities conducted from another state, and law enforcement in his state claimed they couldn't act on violations that occurred in my jurisdiction. I spent months navigating between different court systems, trying to get protection that seemed impossible to obtain. The case finally reached resolution when Michael violated his probation by traveling back to Arizona and approaching me directly outside my new workplace. This violation resulted in a more serious sentence: 4 years in prison without the possibility of early parole. but only after I'd spent nearly 5 years total dealing with legal proceedings, court appearances, and the constant threat of his return. It's been 2 years since Michael was sentenced for his probation violation, but I still receive updates about his status through the victim notification system. The legal process taught me that restraining orders and criminal convictions provide limited protection against someone determined to continue stalking, and that the justice system is often more concerned with the rights of perpetrators than the safety of victims. The scariest part wasn't the stalking itself. It was discovering that the legal system designed to protect victims can become another form of victimization, forcing you to repeatedly relive your trauma in courtrooms while watching your stalker receive minimal consequences for behavior that fundamentally altered your life and sense of security. The legal marathon became a form of institutional stalking that lasted longer than the original crime and caused almost as much psychological damage as the stalking itself. Let's move to our 11th and final story. Receiving a phone call from a detective in Portland asking if I knew why my personal information was found in a stalker's apartment wasn't how I expected to learn that I'd become part of a multi-state stalking network. But when Detective Sarah Chen explained that my case was connected to at least 15 other women across the Pacific Northwest, I realized that what I'd thought was an isolated incident of being followed and harassed was actually part of a sophisticated criminal organization that traded victims like collectible cards. I was a 34-year-old software engineer living in Seattle, and my stalking experience had seemed relatively minor compared to some of the stories I'd heard from other women. A man named Kevin Walsh had been following me for about 6 months, showing up at my coffee shop, appearing at my gym, even sitting in his car outside my apartment building. When I'd reported it to police, they'd taken a statement, but explained that without direct threats or physical contact, there wasn't much they could do legally. The call from Detective Chen changed everything. Kevin Walsh had been arrested in Portland for stalking a different woman, and when they searched his apartment, they'd found detailed files on dozens of women from multiple cities. My file was among them, containing information I'd never shared publicly, and photos that had been taken without my knowledge from locations I'd never seen Kevin visit. "We're not dealing with individual stalkers," Detective Chen explained during our first phone call. "We've uncovered a network of men who share information about targets, coordinate surveillance activities, and even trade victims when they move to different cities or when the stalking becomes too risky in one location. Your case is connected to similar cases in Portland, Vancouver, Spokane, and at least 6 other cities." The investigation revealed that Kevin hadn't been working alone. He was part of an online community where stalkers shared techniques, traded information about targets, and even coordinated their activities to avoid detection. When one stalker faced legal consequences or needed to lay low, other members of the network would continue monitoring his targets, ensuring that the surveillance never stopped even when individual perpetrators were forced to step back. Detective Chen showed me evidence that made my blood run cold. The network maintained detailed databases of their targets, including personal information, daily routines, workplace details, family connections, and even psychological profiles based on observed behavior. My file contained information that Kevin couldn't have gathered through his own surveillance. Details about my work schedule, my family members, and even my medical appointments that had been collected by other network members. The most disturbing discovery was that the network had been tracking me for over 2 years before Kevin ever made direct contact. Different members had been conducting surveillance in shifts, documenting my routines and gathering information while remaining invisible to me. Kevin's appearance in my life wasn't the beginning of my stalking. It was just when the network decided to assign a primary operative to my case. The investigation expanded rapidly, as detectives in multiple jurisdictions compared notes and discovered the scope of the network's activities. They'd been operating for at least 5 years, with membership fluctuating between 20 and 30 active participants. The network had sophisticated protocols for sharing information, avoiding detection, and even helping members relocate when their activities attracted law enforcement attention. But the network's activities went beyond simple stalking. They'd been using their surveillance data to commit identity theft, fraud, and even burglary. Members would share information about when targets would be away from home, what security measures they had in place, and what valuable items they owned. My apartment had been burglarized 8 months earlier, and I'd assumed it was a random break-in. The investigation revealed it had been conducted by a network member using information Kevin had provided about my schedule and security habits. The psychological impact of learning about the network was devastating. Every interaction I'd had with strangers over the past 2 years became suspect. Had that helpful man at the grocery store been gathering information? Was the friendly jogger who always seemed to be running in my neighborhood actually conducting surveillance? The network's distributed approach meant that I'd been under constant observation without ever realizing it. Detective Chen coordinated with law enforcement agencies across multiple states to build cases against network members. The investigation revealed that they'd been targeting professional women between the ages of 25 and 40, specifically selecting victims who lived alone, had predictable routines, and maintained active social media presence. I fit their target profile perfectly, which explained why I'd been selected for long-term surveillance. The legal proceedings were complex because the network's activities crossed multiple jurisdictions and involved both federal and state crimes. Some members were charged with stalking, others with identity theft or burglary. And the network's organizers faced conspiracy charges for coordinating criminal activities across state lines. Kevin Walsh ultimately pled guilty to multiple charges and received 4 years in federal prison. But the most chilling aspect of the case was discovering how the network recruited new members and identified targets. They'd been monitoring social media, dating apps, and even professional networking sites to identify potential victims. They'd also been recruiting new stalkers from online communities dedicated to harassment and misogyny, teaching them surveillance techniques and providing them with established targets to practice on. The network had been planning to expand their operations significantly before law enforcement intervention stopped them. They'd been developing mobile apps to coordinate surveillance activities, establishing safe houses in multiple cities where members could stay while conducting operations, and even creating fake businesses that would provide cover for their surveillance activities. Detective Chen told me that the investigation ultimately led to the arrest of 23 network members across 7 states and prevented the stalking of dozens of additional women who had been identified as potential targets. But she also warned me that networks like this were becoming increasingly common as stalkers used technology and online communities to coordinate their activities and avoid detection. It's been 2 years since the network was dismantled, but I still receive updates about the various legal proceedings and parole hearings for network members. I've moved to a different city, changed my name, and completely altered my online presence. But the knowledge that I was part of a systematic targeting operation never stops being terrifying. The scariest part wasn't that I was being stalked. It was discovering that my stalking was part of an organized criminal enterprise that had turned harassment and surveillance into a collaborative effort involving dozens of perpetrators who shared information, coordinated activities, and treated their victims like commodities to be traded and exploited by a community of predators who had weaponized technology and social networks to make stalking more efficient, more comprehensive, and nearly impossible for individual victims to detect or escape. If you've made it through all 11 of these disturbing stalker stories, you now understand that modern stalking is sophisticated, patient, and often completely invisible until it's almost too late. These weren't careless victims. They were ordinary people who became targets of predators, who turned everyday activities into surveillance opportunities. Protect yourself now. Review your social media privacy settings immediately. Remove location data from photos, vary your routines randomly, and trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Check your vehicle for tracking devices, install security cameras, and document everything suspicious, no matter how minor it seems. The reality check. Your digital footprint reveals more than you think. Audit your online presence from a stalker's perspective. What could someone learn about your routine and vulnerabilities? Be especially careful about fitness apps and location services that track your movements. Take action. If you've ever felt like someone was watching you, don't wait to take protective measures. Subscribe to VerifiedFears and hit that notification bell. This knowledge could save your life or someone you care about. Share this video with the women in your life, because stalking awareness is community protection. The predators in these stories succeeded because their victims didn't know what to look for. Don't let that be your story. Your safety is worth more than convenience or politeness. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and I'll see you next week with more true horror stories that will change how you see the world around you.